So what's the deal with giving? That's what we're going to find out in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Boy, this has been really good. And now we're going into a different topic that has to do with the past dispute that Paul has had with the Corinthians. Hi, this is Jill from the Northwoods talking about the Bible one small chapter at a time. This is one of those chapters that it seems simple on the surface, but it gets uncomfortable fast when you slow down and you really listen to it. Now, Paul is talking about giving, but he is telling a story, and the story starts somewhere unexpected. The Macedonians, those are going to be, is closer in towards Greece. And remember, that is the parentage of Alexander the Great and Philip the Macedonian. So Greek, but a Greek split off. And he brings them up, and he doesn't say what you might expect, like, look how successful they are. Look how much they gave. Instead, what he says, that they're under severe affliction, that they are in extreme poverty. And he says something that doesn't make sense in the way that the world makes sense. Now, remember, Corinth looked at people as part of their success. You know, that people were saying bad things about Paul because look how shabby he is. He doesn't look like a great man of abundance and wealth. Clearly, God's not with him. They treasured people who looked wealthy, people who looked wise, and people who were doing well, had abundance of things. And so now he's going to go on and talk about the reality of what's going on in Macedonia. And he says that their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty overflows in the wealth of their generosity. And you think, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense because poverty does not usually overflow into generosity. And affliction usually doesn't produce joy. This would probably be something very odd to the Corinthians because they have a different view of the way the world works. And those believers in Macedonia, they didn't have much. And yet they wanted to give, and they gave what they had. Not because anyone told them to, not because Paul pressured them to. It actually says that Paul begged them for the opportunity to help the believers in Jerusalem who were suffering. We believe this is the famine that was talked about in Acts. They gave what they could, and somehow they even gave more than that. And Paul says that that's the key to all of this, that they gave themselves first to the Lord. It reminds me of that woman who was at the temple, and she gave the last copper she had, and Jesus said it was more than all these wealthy people who were giving a lot more. But the story starts there, and I think about, giving today and the stories we tell ourselves, where we see people who donate millions to a cause or gave a huge amount to a church building, and this disaster and that disaster. And again, that's not bad. People are helped, people helping people. That is what is the most important thing. But these stories are always about numbers. And Paul's story isn't about numbers at all. His story is about people who gave in a way that didn't look impressive probably, except it was impressive to God. Because the important thing that in the midst, they aren't looking at bigger donors in the story. They are looking at the people who are giving with their heart and giving what they can and what more than what they have. And so we can see ourselves, I think, in that story of Macedonians, particularly, those of us. I go to a church and there are people who donate lots to build the church. And I'm not in that kind of a position. I'm not doing poorly, but I'm not someone who can build a church. And there are a lot of people who do, and we appreciate them, and they are wonderful. But most of us are just normal givers, right? And Corinth was different, like I said, at that time. Paul turns back then to the Corinth because Corinthians aren't struggling in the way Macedonia was. Corinth has money, resources, huge hub of trade and banking. They were gifted, they were confident, they knew that they were doing well, and they were doing a lot of things well too. But Paul says that you excel in faith, and you excel in knowledge, and you excel in speech, and you excel also in love. So they are not just wealthy, and they're just not philosophers, in that kind of sense. He says that they are doing many of these things very, very well. This is Paul's saying, I believe in you. I know what you can do. And now he's saying, finish what you started. We think that when we look at that chapter, that what had happened is that they had been doing great helping out the places with famine, the church in places with famine, namely in Judea. And because of this broken down relationship between Paul and the church of Corinth, whatever went on with them and the angry letters and all of that, that also had started breaking down as well. They already wanted to give. They were already talking about it. Maybe they were already collecting it. But now something happened. And Paul is saying, you know what? Let's finish this thing. Let's make this thing happen. But the important part is he says, I'm not commanding you. Paul says it very clearly that this is not a command. I'm not ordering you to do it. He's not saying you have to give. You have to give this amount. Here's what you owe to the church at large. Instead, he's saying that this is an opportunity to show that your love is real. And that's a different way to think about giving. We have seen churches, I think, on both sides of it. Some churches, like even my own, if you're a guest here, we don't expect you to give. Then we see other churches. I saw one church that was somewhat in the region, and they handed out bills to people depending on how many times they went to communion and came to services. And that's not the way. The way is to think about it differently, that this branches out from love instead of obligation and ordering. And he brings Jesus into it too. And that's really where the big shift happens here. He was rich. God is rich. But for his sake, he became poor. And by his poverty, he became rich through what God had shown in all of this, right? So he lives in heaven. He has everything. He made everything. He did everything, but instead made himself poor so that we all can be rich through his saving grace. And I used to think that meant that Jesus left heaven with streets of gold and came down to that's part of it too. But really what Paul is talking about is not status, power, or privilege. Jesus had everything. He didn't have to come. He wanted to come. He chooses, and God chooses all the time, to be with humanity. He chose humility, limitation, suffering, and that's something far richer than any money can be. He had life with God in heaven. That's the most important thing. And so this is that pattern that Paul keeps pointing to, that we're not talking about fairness, and we're not going to mention, I'm not going to guilt you into this, and I'm not ordering you to do this. And what he's saying is that God doesn't measure what you give against what someone else gives. This isn't a competition. He looks at what you're willing to do with what you have. And that's the important part. Again, like the elderly woman with the 3 copper coins. And Paul reaches, way back into scripture and talks about another story about how when they were in Exodus and they were gathering manna in the wilderness, everyone gathered. Some gathered more, some gathered less, but in the end, no one had too much, no one had too little. They had exactly what they needed. And that story was about putting trust in God. Trust is what this chapter keeps coming back to, this book keeps coming back to time and time again. And that, do you trust God to be that kind of giver? So then he goes back and starts finishing the chapter by talking about Titus again. We heard about him before. Again, he's a Gentile believer who was sent to help them out, and he was bringing peace to this particular area. And Titus went there. He wanted to go there and help the people. He loved the Corinthians. He believed in them. He was glad to serve them. His heart was, lightened by them, that his heart was warmed by them. And Titus, gave good news to Paul. And Paul says, I've been bragging about you, and I trust that you'll prove me right in all of this, challenging people to do better, to think bigger about how God is with this trust. So that's the way this, particular chapter ends, with this trust and love. And that's where it got personal in a way. I grew up poor. And when you grow up poor, you protect what you have. We went many days without meals at all. I joked about how, well, it wasn't a joke, but we used to make sugar sandwiches because sometimes I'd come home from school and the only thing in the house was a loaf of bread, some butter or margarine in the refrigerator, and sugar in a canister. Well, I made sugar sandwiches. Not very good for you, but you know what I mean? We did what we can. And suddenly when you get older and when you start, having what you have, you start thinking, is this going to go away? Will I have what I need later on in life? And so sometimes I feel like that same way. I got to grip onto my money. I have to save every dime. I have to ensure that I can live in my old age because no one else is going to do that for me. And, you don't feel like someone who has money, even though when you objectively you do. And so that's where it is. And because the Macedonians didn't give out of security because, we have plenty. They gave out of joy. And that is really, really hard. And that's where Paul is talking about this in the crisis. That's, I think, difficult, for some people, like I said, particularly when you grew up poor and you start thinking about what it is you're going to need for the rest of your life. And so what I'm going to meditate on is the way that Paul keeps circling back, not to money, but to the heart. The Macedonians weren't giving because they were comfortable or secure or they met their needs and now they're going to give above and beyond. They were giving while they were afflicted. They were giving while their needs were unmet. And their future was uncertain. And Paul's describing that their giving was an outflow of joy. And I think that makes me pause because joy isn't usually where I start when I think about generosity. And that's where I think I falter, is I usually start with calculation. Well, here's my budget. Now let's think about this cautiously. What do I need, to ensure my security? But what this chapter invites us to do, I think, instead is what if generosity flowed out of trusting God that I will have what I need? And that's the real question, is what holds us back? What holds me back? And Paul reminds us that Jesus himself stepped into poverty. Paul stepped into poverty, and not just financial poverty, but humility, limitations, suffering on this earth, so that all of us could receive far greater riches than money. We want to be shown that God's gifts to us are beyond what the financial world can help us with or teach us about, and that trusting God is above and beyond everything. And so I'm going to sit kind of with that uncomfortable thought that this isn't about obligation and it isn't about budgets, but it's about participation in God's grace and God's giving. God gives, we give. And so we get to participate in that. And what I'm going to pray about is that how hard this is for me. God knows how hard it is for me, that it can shift into fear when I look at budgets. And it feels wise. Of course it feels wise. I'm going to look at my budget. I can see what I can give. I can see what I can do. That's wise. And that's the smart thing to do. But instead, it is about me securing my own future without trusting in God. And so I can see myself in that, that kind of thinking. And the Corinthians were capable. They were wealthy. They were sincere. And they had the intention to act, but something caused them to hesitate. Like I said, it could have been this fight that they were having with Paul. And so when we talk about the Macedonians' generosity, it doesn't make earthly sense. And instead, God is saying, trust me. Trust me to give what you need. Ask me to give you what you need. And that is the most important thing. And so it's helpful for us to release, I think, this idea that generosity is about the bottom line budget. And to help us release that idea that generosity will leave me lacking, that I won't be able to pay my bills because he's the one who provides. It's funny. I know some really incredibly generous persons in my life, and you know what? They never suffer because of it. So I'm hoping that teach me that lesson, because like I said, it's not a command, and I don't want it to do because I feel guilty or I want to prove something to myself, but I want it to shape my heart. And I hope that we all can think about that in shaping our hearts as well. And when I struggle, remind me of Jesus, who willingly stepped down, emptied himself of everything, and trusted in God. And what I want to share with others is that giving is about revealing who we trust, what we trust. Paul never tells the Corinthians how much to give, nor does he tell us how much we must give. Instead, he tells them a story of a people who had very little, but had joy in what they gave. And in a world that's constantly measured by worth and dollar amounts and secured by savings, and success is measured in accumulation, 2 Corinthians 8 reminds us that we live by a different measure, that we have time, resources, ability that have all come by the grace of God. And when we give from that place, we aren't losing something. We are participating in the eternal that God has given. We also give, that we are participating in how God acts in this world. And the question isn't really, how much do I owe, or what am I freely willing to give up on my budget, but what will I offer? That generosity flows from joy instead of fear, and it becomes one more way that we get to participate in the gospel in everyday life. All right, everyone, thanks so much. I appreciate you watching and listening. You can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. You can look for my website, jillfromthenorthwoods.com. I'd love to hear from you. Put a comment right here and let me know if you are going and following along in the slow roll through the Bible, one small chapter at a time. Thanks so much. Have a great day.